We're now going to continue with the 19th century. Now, when we're talking about 19th and 20th century art, we usually don't talk about artistic periods. We talk about art movements, and I guess it's because they seem to move in and out so fast. So you have a number of different styles and theories about what art should be. And of course, there were other art movements that I've listed here, but here are 5 major art movements of the 19th century. And as you already know, Neoclassicism was both 18th and 19th century. We've already discussed that. Romanticism rises up in opposition to Neoclassicism. And then realism is in opposition to both of them. Then we have Impressionism, and then just a general term, Post-Impressionism. We've already discussed Neoclassicism, but you should realize that Neoclassicism and Romanticism were existing at the same time. For example, when Ingres was in a room, and the romantic artist Delacroix walked into the room, Ingres would stomp out. He didn't even want to be in the same room with him. And this tells you something about what was going on with these different ideas about art. You almost want to put in front of every one of them, art should be. In other words, it wasn't like, okay, we'd have all these different art styles. They often rose up in opposition to what they believed was some failing in the other artistic style. So Romanticism appeals to the emotions and senses. Now, think about that. We talked about Neoclassicism in saying that appealed to the mind. And so Romanticism said, no, it's not all about this rationality stuff. It's about emotions. It's about senses. How do you show that? You show it with loose brushwork. You show it with strong colors, sometimes bright, sometimes dark, but strong colors, and dramatic compositions. There was a quarrel that referred back to 17th century art. The artists who preferred disegno were called the Poussinnists. The artists who said, no, it should be using bright colors and loose brushworks were the Rubbenists. And as you can see, that's where Romanticism comes from. Now, the subjects in Romanticism often were what you might call long ago and or far away. The death of Sardanapalus, something that occurred in 1615 BCE. And frequently there were exotic places or subjects chosen from literature. For example, Delacroix did paintings from a scene in Ivanhoe, from Shakespeare, from Dante, as well as the Bible, mythology, history. And then you also see current events shown, but with an extremely emotional interpretation. The first artist I'm going to talk about is Francisco Goya. Now, he's a Spanish artist, so he doesn't really fit into French Romanticism. But when people are writing a textbook, they often place him with the Romantics because he paints with loose brushwork, and many of his works of art have strong emotion. As a court painter, many of his works are portraiture, portraits of the aristocrats. But he also painted many paintings and prints that show man's inhumanity and folly. And those are what we're going to look at. Now, we want to place him in time. One of the things that he saw that showed directly man's inhumanity was the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. And he witnessed this. So the first painting that we're going to look at, which is the executions of the 3rd of May, 1808. And often we just use the short title, the 3rd of May, 1808. Now, using a date is suggesting that the painting has to do with something that happened on that date. And just as if in America we would say that the painting was called July 4th, 1776, we'd expect a painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So here, what we're seeing are executions of the Spanish people. The Napoleonic army was probably the best army that Europe had ever seen. And of course, it came into Spain, took over. But when there was a rumor that they were going to kill the royal family, and specifically the little prince, the king wasn't that popular, but the little prince was very popular. And people saw him put into a carriage and taken away, and they thought that the French were going to kill him. Well, as it were, they weren't. But the people rose up, and they were massacred. I mean, what kind of weapons would they be using? Knives, pitchforks. And they were up against the best equipped and best trained army that Europe had ever seen. So after this uprising was put down, the survivors were rounded up and marched out to be executed. And that is the scene that Goya is showing us. Goya, of course, is firmly on the side of the Spanish patriots. And when we look at the people who are being executed, you can see that each face is an individual face. And they're reacting to their impending death in very different ways. There's a man coming up the hill who looks very frightened. There's a monk who is praying. The man, who just, I don't even know how to describe the expression on his face, but this man who looks with the wide eyes and solemn face, at his executioners. And then there's the figure on which the painting focuses. The peasant down on his knees, wearing a white shirt, sort of gold trousers, and his hands are raised up. And they're raised up in a semblance of Christ hanging from the cross. And this is something that frequently artists do. They make allusion to a religious subject that is very well known. We saw it with David, showing the death of Marat. And here, the Spanish peasant who's about to be executed. In contrast, the French soldiers are faceless. We just see their backs. They're all in uniform. They're just all in a row. They're faceless automations. They're just a killing machine. And then at the bottom, we see some of the people who've already been executed and the blood soaking into the killing fields. Now, the characteristics of Goya's style, he uses tenebrism. And you can see here we have the light is coming from a lantern. It's taking place at night. It's dark. But the lantern sheds light on the people who are being executed. And then, of course, very, very free and loose brushwork. The influences on Goya? Well, his predecessor in the 17th century as a court painter was Velázquez. So he would have seen paintings by Velázquez in the Prado, in the palace. And he may also have seen some work by Rembrandt. Both these artists paint with loose brushwork. Velázquez, of course, painted a lot of portraits of the Spanish royal family. And Rembrandt painted artwork that we consider to be of great emotional content. And often paintings that seem to relate directly to ordinary people. This painting is, in a way, something new in the history of art. Something called protest art. And before this, war, violence, often treated as a heroic event. Think of David's oath of the Horatii. The men are going off to fight to the death for Rome. It's supposed to be very patriotic. Goya is a person who shows war as cruel, barbaric, and he makes a protest against that within his art. In this case, it's political protest. Of course, there are also other social protests in art. Now, I should point out, though, that Goya did not exhibit this painting at the time of the executions. He's painting it 6 years later. So in a sense, it's not something that he's going to show to the oppressors. It would just get him killed if he did. But it institutes an idea that art can speak against the prevailing authority and can speak and call for changes or protest against something that happened. And we're going to see in the 19th century and in the 20th century artists who do that. It was not only Goya's painting that protested against the horrors of war. He also created an etching series called The Disasters of War. And it was a protest against all of the cruelty of war. He shows civilians slaughtered. He shows babies being killed and women being dragged away to be raped. He shows bodies discarded on the ground. We're going to see that in a minute. And he shows that war is cruel, it is barbaric, it is not glorious and heroic. And so this is part of his theme that he has in many of his paintings, man's inhumanity to man. Man's absolute stupidity, in slaughtering other people. So I thought I'd just show you a few of these. They aren't in your text, but just in connection with the 3rd of May and see some of the other things he did. All of these etchings have captions. Of course, they're in Spanish, but I have translations here. You can see here a heap of dead bodies, and 2 men are looking at them. And they're holding their nose because the stench is rising from the rotting corpses. And I almost feel like this is the aftermath of the 3rd of May. Now, here are the bodies lying around. They've been stripped. And indeed, the French gave the order that the bodies were not to be buried. They weren't to be taken away. In this case, the title of this is Bury Them and Keep Quiet. Here's another one showing the corpses of men tied to a tree. One of them is dismembered. And the caption is, "Great feat with dead men." So it's quite sardonic. Yeah, you're so brave. You know, you can hang up people that have been murdered. And now we're going to go back a little bit in time before the invasion of the French. Goya already was creating prints. This is a combination of etching and aquatint, which we'll explain. He was already creating prints that exposed the follies of mankind. And this is from a series of prints called Los Caprichos, or the Caprices. And it's from the very end of the 18th century, 1796 to 98. The title, as it were, is written out on the painting. As you can see, El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. And that translates as the sleep of reason produces monsters. And so the print is called The Sleep of Reason. Well, first I want to talk about the technique and then the meaning of that print. The technique combines etching and aquatint. And aquatint was a way to get gray tones. If you're printing with, say, black ink on white paper, how do you show what is called halftones, the grays? And we've seen with the woodcut hatching. We've seen with etching and engraving, hatching and cross-hatching. Just by putting lines closer and closer together or further and further apart, you create the appearance of gray. Well, of course, it's still lines. So aquatint is another way, it's a way to create gray tones, halftones. The technique of aquatint is when you take rosin dust, and usually you'll put it in a little bag that's porous cloth, something like cheesecloth. Today, of course, you can put it in a box that has an electric fan on, and the rosin is in there, and it'll blow the dust all around, and you turn off the fan, and the dust settles evenly on the plate. But of course, Goya didn't have anything like that. So you'd probably take a cheesecloth bag with rosin dust in it and tap it so that the dust drifts out and lands on the plate. And then you heat it. And you have to heat it just right. When you start heating the plate, the rosin dust starts to melt. And what you want is to get it just when it will adhere to the plate, but not when it's run together. So it's the little particles of dust are now adhering to the plate, and they're resistant to acid. So you can put it in the acid bath and it will bite between the particles, producing a kind of stipple effect, which creates, which when you apply the ink and you print it, it produces gray tones. Now, obviously, you don't want the same gray over the entire surface of the plate. As you look at this, there are some areas that are white. You're seeing the tone of the paper coming through, and there's areas that are light gray, and there are areas that are a darker gray. So, after you have heated the rosin dust and it's adhering to the plate, you would take liquid stop out, we call it, or varnish, or something that's impervious to the acid, and you'd paint over the areas that you do not want to have, say, a gray tone. And that will leave that area white. When you're putting your letters on, the letters all have to be written on backwards, because when you print, it reverses the image. So once you have all the areas that you want to be white, and they've all been stopped out, so those sections the acid cannot reach, you put it back in your acid bath. And then you can pull it out again and stop out more areas, the areas that you want to be light gray, and put it in again. And then pull it out again and stop out more areas, just leaving what you want to be dark gray. So you can manipulate the gray tones. And then, of course, you use a solvent and clean off the entire plate. It'll clean off the rosin. And then you print it the same way, of course, it is an etching. So you ink it, you wipe it, and you put the paper on it, and you run it through the printing press with rollers that squishes the paper down into the grooves. And here, close-ups, you can see how Goya has used these very, very sketchy lines. And think about the influence of Rembrandt, perhaps, and his prints. And then you can also see this, this gray tones that are, as I said, they look like they're kind of stippled, and that's the aqua tint. The acid has bit between the particles of rosin, and it creates this textured gray. Okay, the sleep of reason produces monsters. What does that mean? Well, look here, we have a man, and he seems to have writing implements on the desk in front of him, and he's fallen asleep. And behind him, rising in a diagonal movement, you have all of the animals that we consider the creatures of the night. And they're bats and owls and cats. And they're sometimes associated, we would, think about them with Halloween. They're often associated with witchcraft. And, many people still believed in witchcraft at this time. But they're symbolizing, they're the monsters that come forth when reason sleeps. In other words, when human beings do not use their reason, their evil and irrational side can come forth and be dominant. Okay, let's look at an example of French Romanticism. And I might say that Romanticism was in many ways an international phenomena. You probably know that there are English Romantic poets. So you have both Romanticism in literature and in art. Now, this art movement, which we call Romanticism, appeals to the emotions and to the senses, and is often marked by strong colors, loose brushwork, and sometimes exotic or dramatic themes. And for our example of a French Romantic, I'm going to show you a work of art by Eugene Delacroix. And this is actually a self-portrait of Eugene Delacroix, and I thought you might want to look at it simply because it looks like the embodiment of what someone would think of as a, romantic artist. It's got the tousled hair and the cravat, and painted with very loose brushwork. The work we're going to look at by Delacroix is Liberty Leading the People, 1830. Now, this also refers to a political event, what is known as the July Revolution. And it took place on July 27th, 28th, and 29th of 1830. When Napoleon fell, the other European countries restored the monarchy in France. And of course, this was imposed on them. And they also had a constitution, and it was supposed to preserve some of the rights of the people. But sometimes the king was not so willing to do that. And so there were a number of rebellions and uprisings in France, in Paris, during the 19th century. This one refers to the popular uprising against the repressive government of the King Charles X, House of Bourbon. And he was replaced with another king who promised to follow the Constitution. So, Delacroix is showing a contemporary event, but it's shown in very emotional and somewhat unrealistic, with the main figure there, terms. Liberty is a personification, probably not a real woman with her dress falling off, waving the flag at the front of the troops. So here we see a romantic interpretation of this uprising, of the July Revolution. And it's shown in dramatic, emotional terms. It's got a patriotic, revolutionary message in which ordinary people charge the barricade. And then, something which of course is not very realistic, you have an allegorical figure who is this woman with the breasts exposed, and her strong arm lifts up the flag and waves it. And this is an allegorical figure of liberty, who's leading the very ordinary people of France, hopefully to victory, possibly to death. And, we're familiar with this concept because we have, of course, the Statue of Liberty, whom we call Lady Liberty, which was a gift from the French people to the Americans. And it's standing in the harbor at New York. So it's the same kind of idea, a female figure who symbolizes liberty. In this case, she's holding up the French revolutionary flag, the tricolor flag. She's holding a contemporary weapon, the rifle with the bayonet on the end. And she's wearing a Phrygian cap, this red cap that was supposed to be worn by the people of the French Revolution, and suggests that the slaves are breaking free. It also shows at the bottom the dead bodies of the people who have already given their lives to the revolution. And of course, the people who are coming after them, storming the barricades, charging forward over the dead bodies of the people before them.